Welcome at the fifth webinar in our series, How to Move Your Business Online. The topic for today is Remote Monitoring with the Internet of Things. How COVID-19 affects how we think about sensor deployments. I am Elizabeth Viljoen of Cerebrate New Zealand, and we create deep thinking events. During this webinar, I want the panel members to help us dream of a could-have-been world, to imagine how smart cities and smart villages could operate during a worldwide pandemic. We have gathered three experts to help us dream. They are Alexandra Deschamps-Sonsino, often first or second on the list of 100 Internet of Things influencers and thought leaders, and one of the most influential tech women in the world. She was founder of The Good Night Lamp and is currently the London project lead for Library of Things and a consultant at designswarm. She is also the author of Creating a Culture of Innovation, which is available for pre-order now, and Smarter Homes, How Technology Will Change Your Home Life, which was published in 2018. Our second panel member is Gert Hutton, Senior Research Engineer at HUMC in Finland. He designs and builds large sensor networks and is particularly good at processing and presenting data in a visual and meaningful way. Some of these networks include the monitoring of water quality, the use of technology to aid post-surgery recovery, monitoring the performance of alternative building materials, and three-dimensional investigation into heat distribution in houses. Currently, he is working on networks such as the measurement of key gases during forest fires, technology that determine the use of glucose in trees by woodpeckers, and early warning systems to notify municipalities of water quality issues. Our third panel member is Mariana van der Walt, Managing Director at the New Zealand Institute for Rural Entrepreneurship. She is a seasoned intra and entrepreneur that introduced and co-established the first design factory in New Zealand, and during her time as Centre Director for the Centre for Research and Applied Innovation at Wintec, and established the only impact hub in Australasia. Currently, she is focused on helping small towns to embrace innovative economies and new innovative trends to stimulate local growth and well-being. By now, almost every world citizen will understand the concept of a worldwide pandemic because every single person in the world has felt the impact of COVID-19. But to imagine a could-have-been world, we'll need to grasp some of the other concepts I have mentioned. Gert, will you please explain the term Internet of Things for us?
Yes, the Internet of Things are basically vague, but also very specific. So, as a definition, the Internet of Things are basically physical objects that are uniquely identifiable. They connect to other things and other systems via the Internet. So they are connected. The thing usually consists of an architecture that consists of what we call a perception layer, a transmission layer, a computation layer, and then an applications layer. So the perception layer, as you can think, is a layer where you have sensors and processors doing the first sort of computation on the data they get from sensors. The communications part is where the data is then sent onwards to whoever needs that data. That could be other things or cloud-based databases or something like that. The computation layer is where you have a major big data kind of computers that analyze and process all this data. And then finally, the applications layer, where users can have access to the data, and actually the data is used to create value for whatever people want to use it for. So probably a little bit controversial, but one of the very good examples of an IoT object or thing is a smartphone. It's uniquely identifiable, it has sensors, it communicates with other things and systems. Data is collected and integrated on a vast scale and used by a lot of organizations. So you will find that mobile phones or smartphones has been one of the key technologies in kind of the fight against COVID, but we'll speak more about that later.
I've read of the geostation in Innisfil in Canada and smart villages in Scotland, a green village in Rwanda, and the European Union Action for Smart Eco-Social Villages. So Mariana, will you please clarify the difference between smart villages, as I named, and smart cities?
So there are lots of similarities between smart cities and smart towns or smart villages. So I'm not going to look at the similarities because there are also some important differences between them. In small towns, you have more of a focus on creating new opportunities, making use of scarce resources, or overcoming infrastructure barriers. So everything that people in small towns are interested in usually center around these things. So if smart cities or smart villages and the technologies used, usually for smart cities, then used in small towns, don't do one of these things, people are less interested because it's much easier to understand behavior in small towns. In cities, it is used often to understand behavior of crowds. So let me give you an example rather than to talk just about it in concept. For instance, a small town can quite easily set itself up as a destination for a health issue, like for instance diabetics, and then the whole town can censor not only the individual to understand their health, but also everything they interact with, so that the person that actually lives there with diabetics then can live a normal life and their illness can become totally transparent, because everything in the environment and everything that they interact with actually cater and never put them at risk, as well as the information is sent on to the health providers automatically so that they can interact on a need-based rather than for the person to constantly be reminded of the health issue that they have. If you want to look at an environmental example, you can look at, for instance, the regen villages, REGEN villages in Europe, where whole communities live together. They create their own energy, they process their own waste, as well as they live as a community together, and it's very technology rich, and the whole community is informed by, as well as create opportunities through technology that they implement and sensor networks that they implement.
Yes. Alex, what do you mean by sensor deployment?
I think it really depends on, and I think that Mariana's point is really crucial, because it really depends on the size of where you want to be. I mean, are you counting sheep in a field and making sure that the flock is still there because the field is many hectares wide? Are you counting the number of people in a crowd? Are you counting the number of elderly people in a room? And for each, or in a home, for example, so for each size of space, the deployment will be different. And that deployment can mean one sensor, it can mean sensors in every room, it can mean sensors on every tree, because you're trying to measure the sort of progress of fire or falling in a particular region. It could be that you are trying to protect an area of the city against terrorism of some sort. And so where you put the sensors, how many sensors, and the area that you're covering really dictates the kind of deployment that you have.
Gert, there is another thing that fascinates me about the Internet of Things, and that is the integration of various fields of expertise. Maybe you can give us insight to understand the diversity of scientists and engineers involved in one or two of your research projects.
Yes, it's actually quite ironic that the Internet of Things started its existence and it was based on the convergence of quite a number of different technologies. So on a second note, in today's day, it's become an enabler between researchers. Sensors and technology in the transmission layer have become readily available and very cost effective. So more people are using them and more of them as well. In my area, researchers are able to collect data that they simply were not able to do 5 to 10 years ago. And this includes both the granularity of data and the quantity of the data. So this is also has the effect that research groups are now including a wider set of skills that require micro-specialization in specific fields. I'll give you an example a little bit later, but one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is the impact of forest fires on carbon cycles. And in this project, we looked at biochar. We needed 2 biochar experts, a forest scientist, a forest fire scientist, an image analysis specialist who specializes in drone and satellite images, and a sensor specialist, which was me. So this is a wide variety of people that worked on this project. And funny enough, the value lies in the cross-pollination of knowledge and experience, and that brings out unique value. We've stumbled upon something to measure that is unique and is actually quite needed in a trip in a car between 2 spots in heavy rain. So quite a good discussion between 4 different people with different backgrounds in that time. So in this experiment, we actually generated around about 20 or 30 terabytes of data in a run that actually lasted only 4 hours. So it gives you an idea. We're still analyzing the data, by the way. It requires a wide set of skills nowadays.
It's mind-boggling. So let's start dreaming. A pandemic such as the world is experiencing this year forces innovators to find creative solutions for problems that used to be purely hypothetical, or to create solutions for problems that were very real before but need not be today. We are going to look at 4 scenarios where remote monitoring with the Internet of Things can have a positive impact during a pandemic. Healthcare, public space and policy making, family relationships during long separations, and the environment during periods when we live mostly indoors. So let's talk about healthcare. We are confronted with a virus that is so contagious that healthcare workers risk their lives by treating patients. A news release on 17 September by the World Health Organization states that about 14% of COVID-19 cases reported to WHO are among health workers, even though they make out only 2 to 3% of the population. There is also a new spike in numbers. According to data analysis released by Johns Hopkins University on 26 October 2020, new confirmed cases are rising in the USA, France, Italy, India, and the UK. Alex, please explain the emerging role of wearables and temperature sensing, such as ADT 410.
Thanks. This is so emerging. It's very much, I think on the edge of what is probably practical and desirable, which is really thinking about what temperature sensing, instead of having your temperature taken every time you walk into a restaurant or you attempt to walk into a restaurant, that this is a constant sensing that is happening because of something you might be wearing. It might be a bracelet. It might be something that you wear that doesn't actually have an aesthetic function, but is really literally there to measure your temperature as you go. These are attempts that are being made in order to accompany a track and trace app. And so something more traditional like an app would have this added wearable element. likelihood of this being actually useful for asymptomatic patients is really where the problem lies. But everybody is trying to get their hands on solutions that can help at least that identification of someone who might be starting to feel ill, starting to have the beginnings of a fever, because we acknowledge that that's one of the top 3 symptoms that people suffer from. But again, it's not perfect, but these are some of the things that are starting to get both cheaper, more accessible, but also in the hands of people who might not be traditional healthcare developers or traditional healthcare technologists. So the component that you mentioned is actually a breakout board by Ada Fruit, which is a maker community, and they've made a breakout board, and that board allows you as a hobbyist to develop applications that sense the temperature, and that temperature will be accurate to the nearest 0.5 degree. And so the dissemination of these kinds of tools in the hands of hobbyists, of people who are not, again, necessarily in the forefront of the crisis, means that we might have a creative set of responses that might come in and, just as Gert was just saying, come in and bring other perspectives and in other contexts.
Yes. Yesterday I talked to a friend who is worried about cancer, and if we can develop things like that to detect it early, it will also be fantastic. But Gert, in at least 2 of your projects, you have used technology to monitor healthcare. What other devices can we implement to overcome these current risks?
The problem is actually, well, we can divide it into rough categories. So the first one is identifying people that have been infected and stop the spread of the infection, because you want to break that cycle. And the second one is trying to treat people that is actually sick. There's a third aspect that relates to people that's not sick and are going on with their daily lives that also need medical attention, but not sick of COVID. So if we look at identification and containment, the first problem is the vastness of the problem. I haven't counted last time, but about 8 to 9 billion people on the planet. And that in itself creates a huge implementation and logistics problem. So it is probably not practical in the short time frame that we've had so far with COVID. The second, as Alex has mentioned, high quality direct measurement to determine whether you're COVID-19 infected or not is not really possible only with temperature, because roughly about 20% of the people that's sick with or has COVID has symptoms. So there's 80% of the people having COVID that is not symptomatic, and one of the key symptoms is temperature. So there's a bit of a problem there. The third one, and the more I think about this, I think the more accurate this is. Mobile phones have become the key IoT system in the fight against COVID. They are pervasive in society, which means everybody has it. So the only thing that you need to do is update or change or create new software or embedded software to help you with this. And once again, one of the most important parts is tracer apps that have been developed in various countries and in various ways. But also we see that people are getting a little bit reluctant to use them due to various reasons. There's privacy issues and stuff like that. In Finland, which has one of the highest adoption rates of COVID apps, the technology is based on basically just Bluetooth, a very short range detection of who is close to you. And once you verify that you have COVID, and it's a special code supplied by the health authorities, you can actually let people know that you have been in close contact. So, and it's up to those people to actually decide what they want to do with that information. So it's far less pervasive, and it's been taken up quite a lot. In middle September, they reckon about more than 30% of Finns have downloaded the app. And by this time, especially with the second wave, I think people are more serious about looking at that. So the other impact is that if you think in terms of IoT and remote health, you have the added advantage that your IoT systems can cater for people with normal chronic diseases, and they can be monitored on a remote basis, and that frees up the medical system to actually look after people that is sick in vast quantities. So in a sense, it actually relieves it as well. I think this pandemic, because it's so widespread, has been quite limiting in terms of the innovations that came out specifically for this, for various reasons, and one of them is logistics. But I think we have the tools already to do a lot.
Yes, I already see the wonderful influence of smartphones. Even in a small country like the one where I come from, Namibia, almost everyone has a smartphone, and it will make it's so much easier to monitor and track the spread of the virus. Mariana, what will prevent governments from implementing these ideas in rural towns?
Elizabeth, I think what is very important to realize is that fortunately, it doesn't depend only on governments to implement this. And I say that's fortunate for various reasons. The one is that small communities are hardly ever prioritized by governments. But in this particular instance, specifically with COVID, what I find is that small communities, and whether they are small communities functioning in large cities or small communities as we find them in villages, they pull together in crises and make things happen for them. But let's look at health specifically. There's a scarcity of health workers in rural towns, and that IoT can benefit that particular problem immensely. For instance, with remote health or with telehealth, or the integration of wearables sending data through your healthcare workers, that can really make a difference in small towns, and also mobile units moving around from small town to small town and then integrate them with wearables. There is still a policy gap with health application, because you're working with people's health, and if the sensors give false information or it's not interpreted correctly, there are policy issues and possibly legal issues. But importantly, there used to be, and I think still there is, a lot of social resistance or professional resistance. But COVID helped a lot to overcome that last one. And I can give an example of that. I live mobile. I live and work from a caravan at the moment. And one of my main issues is to go to my doctor, because my doctor happens to be located in a specific city or town, and I'm there only once a year, if that. And the doctor just wasn't open to seeing me and interacting with me online. And suddenly, since COVID, that's no problem. Having a consultation with your doctor online, that's the done thing. So my health issue or my doctor issue has been resolved. And that has a huge impact on small towns. Many of them do not have a resident doctor. So applications and the use of technology, sensor networks, whether it's individuals, whether it's groups, whether it's measuring other health benefits. I know, for instance, in a small town, there was a guy who started a gym, and he measured the weight that the town loses per year, and it became a thing. They actually put it up on a sign, how much weight the town lost in a specific year. I mean, it was a marketing thing for him, for his gym, but that's what he did. So sensors can help a lot with this. It can bring new economic and social well-being to small towns, but it hasn't penetrated yet because the mindsets are busy shifting towards that, hasn't really done that. COVID has done a lot of pushing that forward, though. And I think there's some exciting times ahead because there's a lot of economic value of new types of businesses that can actually make this happen for small towns. That's why I say fortunately, it's not only government dependent, because governments in small towns have got a love-hate relationship very often.
The more I research your involvement with the Internet of Things, the more I become aware of your drive for global environmental sustainability. Now, social distancing was often the first steps governments implemented to prevent the spread of the virus, and then came physical distancing. Now, Alex, in our correspondence about your contribution to the Petra's Little Books collection, you pointed out the negative impact this policy had on air quality in London. It caught me off guard because social media hype focused on cleaner water and cleaner air because of extended periods of lockdown. Won't you please share your take on how we can monitor our environment better?
Well, I think we find ourselves in a conundrum, which is one where we have, in London especially, which is a metropolitan area of about 14 million people, we found ourselves with an opportunity that people took to transform their urban space into what they called low traffic and low traffic areas. So access to cars was blocked in some areas. However, because of the pandemic and people's sense of that shared space as being dangerous, so things like the underground or trains were the usage of them really dropped to 4% of their usual use. And so what people did instead to get around town was to get in their cars. And so we found now that we have low traffic areas that have come in where cars no longer have access. And so we have enormous areas of congestion that never existed before because there were less cars, and the cars that were there had more space to sort of go around. So that's created a huge amount of new type of pollution because 80% of the people in those cars are on their own in that car. They're not there with 3 other people. They are literally there to isolate themselves away from services that they now deem dangerous, dirty, more stressful. So I think that's an unusual consequence of what are, on the face of it, really good green practices, which is to try to reduce the amount of traffic in the center of the city.
That's so interesting. Gert, you live in a rural place at the moment, so I'm not sure whether you were able to measure this effect, but it must be different in different countries. In your current projects, which is run in Finland, did you notice similar effects on the air and water quality, or were you not able to measure that?
We've been able to measure, but unfortunately, we've had, there's another little thing, elephant in the room called climate change, which has had a huge impact this year in Finland. We've had the warmest winter in, I think it is 80 years. Plus, we had a very strange summer in terms of the rain patterns and so on. So, if there was an effect, it's masked by these environmental changes. The other thing is that Finland is a very widespread rural, low density kind of a country. You've got high population densities in the cities like Helsinki, Tampere, and Turku, and there are problems, but at this stage, there's virtually no difference. I've read a report by Suke about a week ago relating to water quality in all the rivers of Finland, and the water quality hasn't changed. So it's virtually the same as it was a year ago. So it's neither worse or better. But I think the masking effect of the changing climate is hiding a lot of that.
Mariana, you have lived completely off the grid during lockdown, which is an ongoing experiment to test possibilities of rural entrepreneurship and remote work. What policies would you like to see implemented regarding public space and physical distancing?
Yeah, I think the most important impact and the most important thing for small, for let me say regional areas, villages far from cities, is the notion that off the grid sensor local networks. Suddenly, now that the borders are closed, you know that rural New Zealand, the economy depends on agriculture or tourism. The border is closed, and we can't really. Uh, Agriculture is agriculture. Agriculture is doing quite well. But if we look at the impact of small towns and the policies around that, and the fact that the borders are closed, and suddenly, even if the border wasn't closed, people are not that keen on getting in onto the same plane together. What is happening is that virtual traveling is moving is becoming more mainstream. I mean, I come from Africa and I have to watch a waterhole every few days to see what the animals are doing. So virtual traveling has been part of my life for a while. But the other thing is slow traveling, where people make use of things like remote work to go to a country and go away from the cities, outside of the cities, and spend more meaningful time while they also work remotely in the area while they travel. And then there's the appreciation and protection of the environment that became more in the awareness of people. And I think that is because of the slowdown of COVID. People were in lockdown for a period of time. They didn't have time to run away from their thoughts. So their thoughts kind of caught up with them. And we started to reevaluate. So what is the life I want to live? What is important to me? What are my values and things like that? Physical distance, of course, is easier in small towns, but it has also therefore become a place where people want to live and work. So there's a boom in remote work. In New Zealand, we talk about the Zoom towns that's busy developing now. That's really good news for small towns, because talent is moving out of cities into small towns. I'm not sure whether this will continue long term. I do think it's a trend that will really become more and more pronounced in small towns, and small towns can actually set themselves up to be a destination for that. For instance, there's no good reason why a small town can't become a virtual university where they actually attract people on sabbaticals or busy with their PhD studies and provide all the services and the lifestyle for people to actually come and live there while they study or while they do what they do. I want to give an example of a whole country that used internet to really break out of poverty and the constraints of a developing country, and that's Bangladesh. In the early 2000s, the government recognized the value that digital access can bring to their population. And they had a policy, an early policy, one of the earliest countries that actually went that way. And they made it a priority that the whole population will have access to the internet as well as to online or mobile banking. And the population actually used that, and remote work and online freelancing. Bangladesh is still the country that is second most active in online freelancing. As a result of that, the whole population made use of that, and it became a driver for economic development from the 2000s up until it still is today. So the notion that COVID brought into us, that suddenly these remote technologies, or functioning in a remote manner, or keeping physical distance and not moving far away, brought these kinds of opportunities to the table. And this is not small in any way, because I've just given you an example of Bangladesh, a country that had the policy, and they actually proactively helped their population to break out of poverty and the constraints of opportunities of a developing country, making use of internet and remote banking. So this is what access can do. Internet of Things can take this to the next level. and I'm not quite sure yet how, but the Internet of Things can certainly bring about new types of networks and online and remote engagements that will help overcome these types of constraints that rural towns in general, but more so in developing countries, experience and find it almost impossible to break out of isolation, lack of access to markets and things like that. So I'm really looking forward to see what Internet of Things are going to do for small towns and for rural environments.
Yes, Mariana, we've discussed this often during previous webinars, how the lockdown situation because of COVID-19 helps everyone to understand and appreciate the concept of remote work. Now for something close to my heart. My son just moved to a time zone 11 hours removed from mine, and because of strict COVID regulations in my country, I might not see him or my parents for a year or 3. I know you have a solution, Alex. During the pandemic, most people discovered Zoom to connect remotely, and by now, many of us are zoomed out. But human-computer interaction is nothing new. Tell us of the importance of early human-computer interaction.
So I came up with a goodnight lamp in 2012, in the middle of what you could call a little bit of a boom around the idea of screenless interactions. So the goodnight lamp is a family of lamps. You have a big lamp and little lamps. You give the little lamps away to anybody around the world. And when you turn the big lamp on, the little one turns on. You can use it to indicate to a family member that now's a good time for a chat, you're available right now, you're thinking of them, or just sharing your habits around the house. And this was very much part of a series of ideas, some of which were commercialized, some of which remained in academia, around the idea of ambient computing. So ideas of devices that you might buy, and you might buy in, on the high street, and they could allow you to connect to another home in a way that wasn't necessarily screen-based. And that, I think the best sort of compendium of those ideas is a book written by David Rose called Enchanted Objects. And that sort of gives a potted history of late 1990s to, I would say, early 2010s, and the kinds of ideas that people talked about. But people were really making a reality that I think would be very useful in this pandemic, but, experimenting around the idea of glanceable information, non-screen-based information, and just giving someone a sense of presence, or sharing with a family member a sense of presence with an internet connection, yes, or with a mobile connection perhaps, but not necessarily with a screen, because as you've said, we're now completely zoomed out. And I think that very intensive, very cognitively intensive activity of staring at a screen, staring at yourself, staring at others via a screen, I don't think it's the only way in which we can communicate.
That's why I encourage deep thinking and slow connections. Did the lockdown period impact your family or friendship circle? And if so, how do you overcome the separation?
Yes, that is a little bit of a more difficult question. The main thing is that a couple of years ago, our family has started to become global trotters. So we have kids in London, Cape Town, in New Zealand. We've got family ties, strong family ties still in South Africa, and some other world countries as well. So we have learned from an early perspective that you need to make contact with people and actually keep up the contact. So we've got a few WhatsApp groups that's quite active, and you can communicate specifically with certain parts of the family. With COVID, interestingly enough, it didn't change anything, because we were already connected and we already had the means and the skills to use the technology in the way that we did. So strangely enough, COVID didn't impact on that at all. It may have improved the frequency of communication, because I think people were more lonely. They don't see their colleagues. They don't interact with other people that much. On a personal level, I did start to understand quite a bit of Finnish, but in the last 6 months, I've lost it because people are working from home. So you don't speak, or I've never been able to speak it, but you don't listen to people, and you can't interpret conversations. At the same time, we've dealt with a really adverse event in the family, a suicide, and also a birth. So the problem is we will not see each other for quite a while still, practically. And our means of communication is I think, quite valid and very effective at the moment. So fortunately, that's one thing that COVID did not really destroy at all.
I think people who do not move around the globe as often as we do might have felt the impact more, and that they really needed more interaction with people than they actually got. Mariana, rural communities are known to be more close-knit. What impact did this period of lockdown have on rural innovation?
I think the important thing is the fact that it brought new opportunities to the table for people in small towns. I spent the first lockup in New Zealand. I spent in Otorohanga, which is a small town about 45 minutes south of Hamilton. And it was really insightful how people dealt with going to the supermarket, how people dealt with, there were a few cases of COVID in the town from a cluster down in the south of the South Island. People actually went to a wedding there, and how the whole town just came together and dealt with that. And it really was people pulling together, but at the same time what happened, and I can only say this in retrospect after we are no longer in lockdown, what I find in small towns, that suddenly the people who used to insist on face-to-face meetings, small town people didn't talk to you unless you drive all the way there and have a meeting and talk to them. Suddenly they are all happy to have meetings online. This is bound to bring about significant change in how innovation can happen and penetrate small towns. One of the examples that I can use of what you say, like small town people pull together, it's not only towns, it's regions, it's pulled together. For instance, the Waikato, which is a region in the North Island in New Zealand, the economic bounce back after the first lockdown took less than 6 weeks, and that was because of the local support. People coming together and say, we're in this together, we are the New Zealand team or family, and we are going to support local. So everybody went, and they had, instead of international tourists, they had local tourists. Everybody went to a place where tourists would normally go and locals wouldn't go. To the extent that right now, motorhomes are really cheap to rent in New Zealand. Usually they're very expensive to rent. And everybody and their dog is going to a local holiday spot. So locals just started to support the local economy, knowing that a whole lot of the hospitality and tourist interest will just fall apart, and is one of our biggest economic sectors, and they started to support that. As I said, it took less than 6 weeks for businesses to come back to the other. So we are becoming more comfortable with remote relating, and it's no longer seen as the poor cousin in relationships. And although we need to keep in mind that we need to keep the order in place. It's harder to build meaningful relationships online, but it makes it possible and easy to keep meaningful relationships alive. So there's still that face-to-face thing, but we can now extend beyond our local community, and I think that's big for small towns. So while in-person relating will always be king in small towns, there's more of an openness and the boundaries are not so hard. So the other thing that is possible is for people living in small towns, because of they are now suddenly, all of us have phones, and now added to that we also know how to do video conferencing. They can go out and find their tribe. They can find people with similar interests anywhere in the world, and they can start to become more embedded into communities beyond their local physical community. And as a result of that, we already see there's a plethora of new online businesses and people signing up to become freelancers, of people that live in small towns, because suddenly COVID took the lid away, it took the ceiling away, and they don't feel that isolated anymore. So funny enough, social distancing actually brought about a more openness to the rest of the world in small towns, and it's more local, regional, but it's also more global, that people are more open to engage globally as a result of that.
Yes, there's so much that we can learn from rural communities. Gert, before we return to the effects of the pandemic on the city landscape, I first want to look at the rural landscape. How are environmental monitoring and precision agriculture contributing towards a better, more sustainable world?
I think agriculture is one of the areas where definitely IoT has had a huge impact. So we are entering times where climate change is becoming more visible and has a greater impact. And we're also facing environmental problems for a number of years due to the misuse and the wrong use of fertilizers and stuff like that. But we're also entering a time where our future is restricted in terms of the way we use water, the minerals that's available, and other resources that's available. So it's kind of a set of issues and problems that's dawning on us at the moment. So to start with, there are three sort of areas that has played quite a role. So one of them is that IoT has actually made it possible to accelerate research in a lot of cases. So we are getting better and more pervasive data gathering, and we can make conclusions very quickly. We can actually determine changes very quickly, whereas in the past we couldn't have. So we're also able to survey large crop fields and stuff like that with precision in terms of where shortages are and where specific minerals are needed. So if you connect that knowledge to smart systems in precision agriculture, where you can apply fertilizers sparingly and in some cases not, and in some cases a little bit more than the average, it helps you to actually lower that environmental impact. It also helps you to save on fertilizer, which is going to become one of the key issues in the future. That's not too far away. So we need to keep up the volume of food that is produced because, well, the world's population is growing. One of the projects I'm involved in as well, we kind of measure the quality of cattle feed in silage that's harvested in summer. So it's put on a huge canvas and used during winter for cattle. And this helps the farmer to optimize the way he feeds the cattle, which also helps him to financially survive better or even thrive. So there's optimization, and then finally you get supply chain problems in the agricultural world. So IoT in the past has helped us understand where critical delays are, where specific problems in the food chain, supply chain is evident. And I know there's an instance where sensors have helped determine the ripening of fruit in shipping containers. So on the long sea voyage from New Zealand to China, they could actually determine specific containers that has fruit that's ripening faster than the other containers. Now, if you have a large supply chain, those are the fruit you want to use first before they spoil. And in that way, you are reducing a lot of waste and wasted effort, wasted resources and minerals. So it helps in the sustainability process. So IoT is going to become part of the key enabling technologies, I think, in our thrive for sustainability.
Mariana, when I talked to a friend of mine, Krista Morrison, she asked me, how do we prevent a digital divide in the protection of the environment if not all regions or countries can benefit from smart technology due to infrastructure limitations?
It's true that there is that digital inequality. And I think what COVID has done is it made that painfully obvious and visible. So that is a positive from my perspective, because it's not that obvious to people that are used to technology, how in small towns that can be very constraining. But COVID has made that painfully obvious. The other good thing is that virtual infrastructure is becoming very affordable, or much more affordable. So you once again, you're not dependent on the big networks as much as you used to be. For instance, in New Zealand, in the beginning of 2020, in January 2020, a new satellite internet technology became available. Of course, my interest is because I'm moving around New Zealand, and currently I'm still limited to where I can get cell phone connectivity. So I was very interested in that. So it's not available for mobile things like caravans yet, but it's much more affordable. It is fast enough to compete with the normal internet that as we know it, and of course it's not that expensive to set up a site, and then you can distribute with Wi-Fi. You can distribute it locally. Of course, we still need to learn how to make use of that. And you can't just go to a small isolated community and plonk down a satellite site and hope that they now suddenly know how to use the internet, because they've never known to use it. So you need to build the whole capability and the whole capacity around it. But it is very possible. And it's one of the projects that I'm really pushing, is to identify where, when the government is done with the rollout of rural broadband, there will still be dark spots, and to actually put satellite internet in those places, because, and I've used the example of Bangladesh, it really is something that holds people back economically and socially in this day and age. The way business happens and the way the economy functions requires digital access. And technology also brings about more environmental awareness. I've used the example of me watching the water holes in South Africa, because I'm from Africa, so I have to see the wildlife every now and then. But it's also used to stop and to impact on animal poaching, for instance, which is also remotely done. So technology can make visible and bring into people's awareness the environment and the impact on the environment, and things that they otherwise would know about but not actually see, and therefore not actually understand. So I think, once again, there is an inequality, and it's pervasive, but there are ways to overcome it. Those ways are becoming more affordable. We just need to remember we need to build the capacity around that, and then also make visible how we can actually showcase the environment through virtual tourism and other means, to actually bring the water holes in Africa where animals are poached into people's lounges, and not just as a far off distant thing in a dark continent somewhere. So there are lots of opportunities, but there's also a lot of work to be done.
Alex, twice in our correspondence, you've written that the pandemic's climate impact was not entirely positive. What is the invisible cost of living indoors during cold winter months and periods of lockdown, such as we've experienced this year?
I think that it's quite obvious that our heating patterns and heating bills will be completely different than what they normally are. Most of us will leave our homes, go to work, be in an office that is heated by someone else, where the bills are heated or paid by someone else, and we're not doing that this year. And so some businesses have responded by giving people actually a small grant to be able to compensate for that extra increase in bills, but that doesn't mean that the climate is benefiting from this grant in any particular way. So we do have a winter in the Northern Hemisphere that will end up costing the Earth in ways that are not necessarily immediately measurable or immediately understandable. Most in the UK, especially where I'm based, there's a lot of apathy around switching providers to a greener or more renewable provider. So only 1 home in 4 will do this. There are attempts to support projects like home insulation, whether that's loft or wall insulation, but these projects can cost tens of thousands of pounds and do require you to leave your house for some time, up to a week. And so it's not an obvious set of things for people to think about right now, but the impact of the pandemic and everyone working from home and staying at home will be important. And the steps that we should be making, we can either not make because of the pandemic or are more limited, either financially or in our immediate needs and our need to stay at home. So I do think that those can see an increase globally in our expense and in our ask of our national grids and our environment.
Thank you. My final question is one that often comes up in conversations regarding the Internet of Things. How will we protect our personal data? Is that even a relevant question to ask, or is it simply driven by our fear?
I think we can learn a lot from the young people when it comes to personal data. We are still cagey about personal data, but the young people, I think they live online and they have found a way to protect their personal data in a way that we don't think about. We think if the best way to protect my personal data is to make sure that nobody gets any access to personal data. The younger people have got a culture that they will openly share, but the moment somebody uses that in a way they're not happy with, they just cut that out and they move in a different way. I think we forget that walking away in the online world is as easy as the click of a button. So it actually requires a lot more transparency and a lot more being respectful with somebody else's privacy. For them to continue to share with you what you want to know. That's the one side of the story. The other side of the story is, I think, and what's happening globally with democracy at the moment, where we see how people are being influenced from afar through their personal data being used in ways nobody ever anticipated. I think there's a lot of policy and legal work that needs to be done to protect and to bring anybody that use personal data in a way that it shouldn't be used. First of all, to set the boundaries, and then also to bring that into the courts in a more meaningful way. I think there's a lot of legislation that needs to be done, a lot of policy work that needs to be done. But from a personal perspective, once that is in place, I think the young people is already telling us how to do that. Walking away is not like breaking a friendship over a cup of coffee. It is like clicking a button and never engaging again. So we can be in a lot more control if technology will make it possible for us to actually cut that out. If policy and legislation will actually protect us, then we have ways and means to lock our digital door, so to speak, if people make use of our data in ways we don't like.
Gert?
I agree with Mariana to a large extent, and there are two levels at which we can respond to that. The first one is literally personal data. As you can see, I live in the beautiful little town of Forsa in Finland at the moment. There's 16,000 people in the town, and when you walk in the forests and stuff like that, there's very little that worries you in terms of personal data. It's just not that important. On the other hand, there are cases where your personal data actually means something. And the sophistication of the negative side of the online world is so huge that it's not in my capability to counter that. I rely on the corporations I trust, that I use for my phone, for my internet service and stuff like that, to actually protect me in a large sense. And if that trust is broken, like Mariana said, it's almost like a click of a button and leaving. And then you will find somebody else that can provide that service. So there are another thing that influences that, and that is the value of your data. Now, my personal data doesn't mean much to a lot of people, so I would like to see a hacker hack into my systems and steal the little bit of money I have. It's going to take him more effort. His hourly rate is going to be very low, to put it that way. And I think that is a perspective that is quite useful. On a larger scale, on a macroscopic scale, it is different. On a macroscopic scale, you can actually start to influence nations, you can influence regions by collecting personal data and actually aggregating it in big data databases and machine learning and stuff like that. In that sense, it's actually quite serious because it will change the world that we know. And we already have examples of that in the US. Facebook groups find that some Facebook groups loses their ability to be on the platform. Some are enhanced and so on. So it is changing society in a way that could be quite dangerous. And that direction lies in the hands of big corporations and eventually literally almost single people. That to me is scary. But my personal data on a personal level, not so much. I think we can survive that.
And I do think that some people are easier influenced than others. Alex, any final words of wisdom?
Oh my God, no pressure. I mean, I also think that we live in a world where people's expectation of privacy has really changed and is also shaped by the workplace. If we look at privacy during this pandemic in terms of employer-employee surveillance, it's really changed quite a bit, whether that is video conferencing services that offer ways to find out if someone is drifting and not listening to a conference call. There is software that now is being implemented that will do a lot of eye tracking, and based on that eye tracking will make assumptions about someone's attention, which are, they have nothing to do with reality. They also go against a lot of cognitive research around how people do deal with their attention, do deal with screens, do deal with what's in front of them, but they will make assumptions and they will become tools for a degree of control, a degree of policing in the workplace, something that I talk about in my new book. But I also, in my first book, also referred to the panopticonization of home life, which has been happening throughout the last 10 years. You can take someone's Instagram feed and pretty much reproduce the inside of their homes. You can probably tell what kind of devices they have. You can probably tell what kind of personal objects of value that they own. And so people have forgotten that these things have just accumulated through years and years and years of content. So the creation of deep fakes or burglary or even just credit fraud are much easier than they used to be. Used to be you had to, try to steal someone's credit card at the point of purchase, and you don't need to do that anymore. So the landscape is more complicated. Our relationship to our data is more complicated, and our relationship to privacy in all walks of life is more complicated. You do not enter certain areas of the city necessarily with the terms and condition that says that the camera and the facial recognition software in that camera is being treated in a GDPR compliant way. And so we have a degrees of opacity around these kinds of issues. And so I think that it's up to us to keep having open conversations, supporting charities that do open policy lobbying, and just try to get as much information as we possibly can and integrate that into people's educations at a very young age so that this doesn't get sprung on them in adulthood. This is part of an ongoing conversation of what citizenship means in the 21st century.
I wish to thank our panel members, Alex Deschamps-Sonsino, Gert Hudson and Marianne van der Walt, for their valuable insights. If you are watching this on-demand webinar, you are welcome to post your questions and we will answer them via email. If you would like to buy or pre-order one of Alex's books, please follow the links provided. Our admin manager also posted links to the various platforms where you can find more information about the work done by Alex, Gert and Mariana. You are also welcome to follow them on Twitter or LinkedIn.